Use technology. Yeah. Try to let them know that there's something happening on this little island in the Pacific. What? What does it say? Yeah, you can just post it. No, should put something. Put Ralph Waldo Emerson tonight at CSL. Click here. Okay. Welcome everyone. Patrick? No, you don't need me. Okay. So we have a wonderful night planned with Roseanne Jones and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But before that, we just want to give you a couple of our announcements to let you know that Cinema Night is on March 30th, and it's 6:30, and the film is I Am. I don't know if you've seen it before, but it's a really great metaphysical film called I Am. And then we want to make sure you know that on Easter Sunday, we are going to have a potluck here. So that's next Sunday, April Fool's Day, which is very strange to have Easter Sunday fall on April Fool's Day. Yeah, so that was the other thing. And I think that's really all you need to know about right now. So without further ado, I'm just going to, yes? Is that next Sunday or a week? No, April 1st. Yeah. Oh, well. Oh, wait. Yeah, April 1st is Easter Sunday. Okay. All right. And here she is, Roseanne Jones. Yay.
Well, aloha. And gosh, thank you for coming. It's so great to see such a good crowd here. And before we start talking about Ralph Waldo Emerson, I would like to do a short invocation. And so if you would like to just sort of relax into your chairs, and if you choose to close your eyes, I'm just going to remind us of who we are and where we are. And knowing that right this moment is the moment that we have in life. And forgetting about what happened before and what is to come later. This is the moment that we live. And knowing this, we live in the Spirit, the source of everything in the universe, the entity that I call God, is in everything and is everywhere and is right here in this moment, in this place, working in and through me and in and through each of you sitting here and watching on live stream and wherever you are. So I am so glad to know this truth, and I am so glad that the unfolding of this discussion about one of the great minds who connected with Spirit is the subject tonight. So I know with ease and grace this talk goes forth, and I know that all the words are there and all the feelings and the sense of who this person is will be here, right here in this room where we are. So I let go of this word, and as we say together, and so it is. Thank you. Aloha. We have more people coming in, and as they get settled, we will start. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson. How many of you don't know anything about Emerson? Oh, you're so welcome. It was great, wasn't it?
You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you. So there were some hands that you don't know anything about Emerson. How many have actually read Emerson? Some of you, yeah, a bit. And did you find him sort of hard to read? Too long ago? Well, what I know is that, he was writing in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and the language of that time for very scholarly people is a little different than our language of writing in today's world where we're very casual. So, do any of you know the name he preferred to be called by? Ralphie. Well, that's a new one. Wally? That is a possibility. Emerson had all of his friends and his loved ones call him Waldo. He was not Ralph, he was Waldo. So I don't want to hear any jokes about where is Waldo, but I do want to know that if at the end of this presentation, I hope to achieve the goal that you feel so close and connected to him that you think of him as Waldo too. So Waldo did a lot of lecturing. And apparently I read that these are some words that he introduced his lectures. He used these words and he said, "Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. The show that never ends." My guess, I'm sorry? Well, they may have taken it from Waldo. But what I do know is that he believed life goes on and on. So, Ralph Waldo Emerson, born in 1803, died in 1882. Ernest Holmes, the founder of CSL, Religious Science, the writer for Science of Mind, are what we call sort of our leader, but it's just in the sense of we follow his philosophy. He was born in 1887 and died in 1960. It's been said that 50% of Science of Mind came from Waldo. And Ernest Holmes quotes him over 20 times in his book, The Science of Mind. One quote is that Holmes writes, "But if we say with Emerson, there is no great and no small to the soul that maketh all, then we may experience a greater good because we have conceived of it." He also quotes Emerson as saying, Emerson advises that we get our bloated nothingness out of the way of the divine circuits. That's one of my favorites. "There is one mind common to all individual men," is another quote. And if you want a friend, be a friend. Emerson. Reverend Scott Aubrey wrote a book called Path of Discovery about Ernest Holmes. And I'm going to read a couple paragraphs. Reverend Aubrey said, reading out of the quotes, "Be yourself," Emerson wrote. "It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude." Ernest Holmes was 20 years old when he first read these words, and he reveled in the spiritual freedom that Emerson offered. "Reading Emerson was like drinking water to me," Holmes said. "I have studied him all of my life." Oh, I did the black dot of death, didn't I?
Yeah, you did, but it's all right. See, that turns it off.
Thank you. Technology. From his study of Emerson, Holmes included three major ideas in his teaching. Number one, we are our own spiritual authority. There isn't any pope, there isn't anybody out there to tell us what to think and what to believe. It's inside, and we do that through meditation. Number two, there is a godlike essence in every person. And number 3, there is a connection between our thoughts and what happens to us. I'm going to give a brief bio of our friend Waldo. 7 of his ancestors were congregational ministers. Now, congregational back in those days, and we're talking the 1700s, early 1800s, congregational ministers, they came from the Puritan heritage. They were very much believers, and you'd almost call them Bible thumpers in today's terminology. I mean, every word was perfectly right, the New Testament, the Old Testament, and there was no room for questioning anything. Those were the Congregationalists. And to think about all of those ancestors, the other thing about being ministers and having this tradition, they were all well read. Many of them learned how to read Latin and Greek because they loved going back into the original texts. So Emerson's grandfather, William Emerson, was a congregational minister in Concord, Massachusetts, and he built the Old Manse, located near Concord Bridge. The Old Manse actually became a story. Is that Nona walking into our group here? The Old Manse was a story that Hawthorne wrote, and it is sort of a famous old building near the Concord Bridge. And Waldo's father, yes, that is a picture of the Old Manse. And his father, William Emerson, broke away from the Congregationalists. He was a liberal-minded Unitarian and the minister of Boston's First Church. Yeah. And he married Ruth Haskins. They had 8 children. Waldo was their 4th child. And Waldo was 8 years old when his father died. Now, I think it's interesting to observe he was the 4th child. So what does that mean, do you think, in the family? Middle child. And he was not the star of the family by any means. His older brothers were the ones, the whole family was like, oh, Charles and Edward, and the other ones were the ones that were really going to go far in life. In fact, his father even wrote in his own journal, I'm very concerned about little Waldo. He hasn't even started to read yet, and doesn't read very well, and he's almost 3 years old. That's very behind. So his father died, and Aunt Mary moved into the house to help. And Aunt Mary was one of his major influences. She was a very eccentric woman. And her name was Mary Moody Emerson. She was the father's brother. That's where she came from. But she really didn't care for her brother very much. But she knew she had a duty. There were 8 children to help raise and to educate. Waldo called her his muse. He noted that her writing was purely original and rich and profound, and he believed that at that time, in her prime, she was the best writer in Massachusetts. He borrowed images, ideas, subjects, and full sentences from her writing and used them in his own verse, essays, lectures, and sermons. There's no picture of Aunt Mary available. Apparently, she was something like 4'6", 4'5", a tiny little woman, powerful. She lived with the family 7 years and acted as their surrogate father. She helped to support the family by generating income and taking charge of their spiritual as well as their intellectual education. After his father had died, they were doing okay, but they had 8 children. But there was a huge debt. he owed something like $40,000 back in 1811 when he died. And they had actually hardly anything. They had some nice furniture, they had lots of books, and they started to sell off everything they had to pay back the debt, because of course you have to pay back the debt. That would be part of the whole deal. And one of the things that Aunt Mary could help with, well, she could teach, and each one of the children, his older brothers, as soon as they were 9, 10, 12, they were out there doing errands, making a nickel here, 25 cents there, doing whatever they could. She encouraged them to read poetry and to delight in nature and take risks, commanding, "Scorn trifles, lift your aims, do what you are afraid to do." Waldo stated regarding his Aunt Mary that it was their privilege to have this immeasurably high standard in their childhood, a blessing which nothing else in education could supply. So, a brief timeline of his whole life. He went to Harvard. Well, first he went to Latin school. Latin school was really like a primary school, but of course, certainly by 4 he was reading, right? Because by 3 he wasn't doing very well reading. But very often students would start to learn Latin at 7 and 8 and 9. He went to Harvard after that, and part of the thing is they didn't have really the whole money to send all the kids to college, but they all went to college, but they did a lot of things like work study. They would do whatever they could because education was so important. As poor as they were going to be educated, and Aunt Mary and his mother, Ruth Haskins, knew it had to happen. So he went to Harvard at 14 years old. Does that surprise you? 14 years old was normal. Normally, by the time you were 14, you should have gotten enough Latin, enough Greek to be prepared to go to Harvard. At that time, there were 250 students in Harvard. And Harvard was very much connected as a religious school, so it wasn't like independent from a religion. And so he didn't do that well. He was mediocre at Harvard. He took a few years off and he taught school and did other things and was trying to find his way. And he finally decided, okay, fine, I'll go to divinity school just like all my other ancestors have done, and I'll be a minister, because what do I do with all this learning and knowing how to speak Greek and Latin and whatever? So he was ordained as a minister of the Boston Second Unitarian Church in 1829. But one of the reasons he stuck through divinity school, because if you see the next thing, 1829, married Ellen Tucker, is because he had fallen in love. And that sort of inspired him, like, I want to get married to her, but I have to have a profession, really. And so being a minister, that would be good. He would have a decent pay. So as soon as he was ordained, he had a little bit of money. He married the love of his life. 1829. A year and a half later, she died of TB. Now, it was called consumption at that time, and that time in New England and probably all over America and probably in Europe, consumption was the dreaded disease. Consumption meant they didn't know it was tuberculosis. There was no cure. TB, or consumption, started not necessarily in the lungs, but it started with maybe your eyesight was going a little funny and you were tired, a lot of fatigue, and you would just sort of waste away to the point that eventually when it hit your lungs, you had coughing spells and you were coughing up huge amounts of fresh red blood. So it was very nasty. And unfortunately, she had it. And also, as you'll learn in the next slide, he had it, His brothers had it. His father's death was somewhat attributed to consumption. It was a condition out there in that time. So she dies. He just was despondent with grief. And in 1832, he actually resigned as minister for many reasons. The one reason that is cited in the books is that he just couldn't agree with a lot of things that were in Christianity that he didn't want to do. And one of them was to perform the rite of communion, because he felt like serving bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ didn't make sense to him. To him, it went back to superstition. It seemed like it was going backwards. And so some of these beliefs he just couldn't go along with anymore. And what did he have to do is be true to himself. And that's what he did his whole life. And so he resigned. Some of the people were happy he resigned. Some were not. Some of them really liked him and really hoped that he would stay. So from that point on, from 1835 to his death, he became world-renowned as an author, an orator, and he was criticized and maligned for many of his beliefs. So some of these things were a belief that God is in all nature and all beings. That was shocking and horrifying to many people. His rejection of traditional church doctrine, and these three beliefs on the bottom were serious. Beyond the first two, anti-slavery, we're talking 1830s. It just wasn't cutting in the 1830s, even in New England, because later, as we got closer to the Civil War, the 1850s, a lot of New England was on board with that belief, but they weren't that early. And so anti-slavery and pro-women's rights, oh please, come on, and pro-Native American rights, this did not go over well. He would walk down the streets of Boston, and sometimes people would just switch and go to the other sidewalk. And like if a woman was walking down the street with her child, she'd run across the street with her child, protecting her child from that devil, that atheist devil. That's what she called him. He was never any atheist, for sure. But there was this criticism that was always following him because he stood up for what he believed in. So here's a list of the loss of his significant loved ones. And the reason I wanted to summarize this is sometimes we think of Emerson as living in an ivory tower. Nothing's ever touched him in life. He's just being an intellectual. He's just thinking great thoughts. And he didn't really have to live life. Oh yeah, besides the poverty, his father had died. The whole family was in suffering because of that. Only 2 of his 7 siblings lived to reach the age of 30, 2 of them. Waldo's beloved wife, Ellen Tucker Emerson, died when she was 19, almost 20. In 1842, he had remarried, and his firstborn son, Waldo, who he adored, like any father would adore his son, he died. He got sick and died. And then 2 other people that he was very close to, Margaret Fuller, and you'll learn more about her. She died in 1850, and his best friend, Henry David Thoreau. He died at the age of 42 in 1862. All of these deaths jarred him. Ellen Tucker Emerson, beautiful painting of her. One of the things I think about this painting is that it shows us, yes, she was lovely, but number 2, look at her clothes. I mean, her family had money. He did not have money. But she met him when she was 16. She was very educated, and they fell for each other. And she died when she was about 19 and a half. So his grief was so strong that even he continued to be a minister, but every day he would walk from his home in Boston to her tomb, which was 4 miles away in Roxbury, if you know Boston at all. And 4 miles one way, 4 miles back. And every day for a year. At the end of the year, he hadn't gotten over her 1 year later. He pushed back the stone on top of her tomb, opened the coffin to look at her. That's how much he felt about his first wife. Despair. He and his brother suffered from consumption. So his brothers, who were very, very sick, died from it within a few years. He resigned as minister. He was sick himself with despair emotionally, but physically he was getting all these signs of consumption. So he sailed to Europe to escape his despair, and really hoping to go and see all the beauty there and be revived and all the wonderful things in Europe. And I tend to think it might have been, okay, this may be my last chance. If I'm going to die, let me go to Europe. So it was a 6-week voyage. And the captain of the ship noted in his log the first day, well, we have a few passengers on board this ship, and this one guy named Emerson, weak. He's not going to make it across the Atlantic. However, he did. He left in December of 1832, and in 1833, he wrote in his journal, "At home, I dream that at Naples and at Rome I can be intoxicated with beauty and lose my sadness. I pack my trunk, embrace my friends, embark on the sea, and at last wake up in Naples, and there beside me is the stern fact, the sad self, unrelenting, identical that I fled from." But there's good news. There was a recovery from this despair. He went on to travel for 6 months from Italy to Scotland, and every place as he went north, he was feeling a little better, and it was spring coming, and the weather was improving. And Naples, he had memories of Naples, and they weren't all great. A lot of poverty. He had never seen poverty like that, because Naples was a big city, and beggars and extraordinary poverty in Naples. And then he went and visited, near Naples, he went and visited Pompeii and looked at the ruins. He went on to Rome. He went to all the famous sites in Rome. And he saw beautiful paintings and other things that he wasn't so fond of, but he had a critical eye whenever he looked at something. He wasn't just going to love it because people said you should love this. He would decide how he felt about things. So he went on and ended up in Florence, spent a month in Florence, loved Florence, was getting better and better, and he eventually ends up in England and connected with 3 people he really wanted to meet. And these were people you may not know of, but Thomas Carlyle, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth. Now, they were all poets to some level. Yeah, that is. Yeah, Thomas Carlyle is this one, Wordsworth, and this is Coleridge. And it was actually Thomas Carlyle that he connected with the deepest. And he maintained an active correspondence with Carlyle for many years, exchanging opinions and thoughts. The other two were a little bit older when he met them, and actually Coleridge was sort of grumpy and had changed some of his ideas, so Emerson wasn't so fond of him. But in the journals that Carlyle wrote, and his wife, and by the way, he was married to one of the smartest, most educated women in England and Scotland. He was actually in Scotland. They both wrote, we had this American to come visit, and he was going to visit for one day, and we insisted he must stay, and he stayed for several days. We loved him so much. He was so enchanting, he was enthusiastic, he was warm, he was loving. They just went on and on. And I'm telling you this because it's really a flavor of who this man was. He wasn't just an intellectual in an ivory tower. So as Waldo's health, energy, and enthusiasm returned, he sailed for home with a vision for his future as a writer, poet, and orator. One of his sayings, and so many of his quotes you can find out there any place on the internet. And now you know he's gone through sorrow. Sorrow looks back, worry looks around, faith looks up. So now I'm going to do a little bit of quoting from Emerson's own words. He got back to New England, got back to Boston, and he writes about enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is one of the most powerful engines of success. When you do a thing, do it with all your might. Put your whole soul into it. Stamp it with your own personality. Be active, be energetic, be enthusiastic and faithful, and you will accomplish your object. Nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm. He was recovering. In 1834, he started writing all these essays. He began his career as a lecturer on the lecture circuit, and that was a way, if you think about TED Talks today, well, that was the way you could actually hear somebody by going from city to city. The lecturer would travel, and there would be these places, lyceums, where they could go and talk. And the common people, this wasn't really just for wealthy people. This was for common, average people to go and hear brilliant minds. And so he had met and married Lydian Jackson. She was very educated too, of course. They had 4 children. You already know that his firstborn child did die when he was 5. They were both grief-stricken over his death, but the others, you'll be glad to hear the others did live long lives, productive lives. And they ended up staying, he had bought a home in Concord, and they ended up staying in that home for 5 decades until they died. And the only reason he could buy that nice home was because he had a small inheritance from his first wife that he had to fight for. And he got it, and it was enough to buy a home. So financially, he was never wealthy, but he was settled, I guess I'd say. So since he had his personal life settled, he could go on and release that creative energy. And he published all these books and essays, including Nature, Self-Reliance, Compensation, Love, Circles, Spiritual Laws, The Oversoul, Transcendentalism, and many more. His publications and lectures brought him worldwide fame, and admirers traveled to Concord to meet him. Now, you probably, as school children, have heard about this one. So in 1837, there was a dedication by the Concord Bridge. This bridge actually stands like, 100 yards away from his grandfather's home, the Old Manse. Rob and I visited there a few years ago, and we spent 2 days in Concord going from home to home, and our hearts were very much touched by all of it. So this was a long poem that he wrote. This is the first stanza. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired. The shot heard round the world. And that last line went around the world. Concord. This is a small village, a sleepy town. You know Concord, don't you? Because you're from Massachusetts. So it's probably 15 to 20 miles outside of Boston, but it was ranked at this time a major literary center, as well as Boston and New York City. They were all sort of the places, because there were these other authors there too. Besides Emerson was the most famous, but there was Henry David Thoreau, Longfellow, Bronson Alcott, and many more. Margaret Fuller. Have you noticed a theme going on over and over in Waldo's life? In that he always was around really educated women for the time period. Intellectual women who read in Latin and Greek and read all the classics. And these are not women to sit back and just knit, you know? And even though they didn't have the rights that women do today, they were educated. So Margaret Fuller, she became a very good friend of him. She went and sought him out, visited him and his wife, and he asked her to stay, and because journeys were long back then, so she ended up staying 3 weeks the first time she visited. They enjoyed her company so much. There was a New York newspaper claimed she was the best read person in America, male or female. She was a close friend of Waldo and his wife and visited Concord often. She was the first woman allowed to use the Harvard Library. Can you imagine? You're not allowed to walk in because you're a woman. Her writings were an inspiration for Susan B. Anthony and the women's suffrage movement. And the tragic part of the story is she and her husband and their young son were in a tragic shipwreck. They were traveling back from Italy. She had lived in Italy, married an Italian man. They had a young child. She was 40 years old, and they were right near New Jersey, right near New York, and something happened, and they drowned. And many other passengers drowned. So before I go on to that one, I just want to again say that I guess like attracts like, but he had all these amazing, educated people around him. Whether they were male or female didn't matter. And they all tended to have the same way of thinking and thinking about the social issues of the day, which one of the most important for him was certainly anti-slavery. He had witnessed a slave auction one time. He was visiting Florida trying to get better. And he got out of church, and right there next to the church, there was a slave auction going by, and he was appalled. And that was probably in the 1820s when he visited. And so it meant so much to him. And the other thing I wanted to mention about Native American rights, if you've heard about the Trail of Tears, if you know about the Cherokee, and how our government at the time decided we wanted to break all the treaties we made, and they pushed all of these Native Americans, including thousands of Cherokee, but many other tribes too. He had written the president, and this letter exists, of his protest against it, and saying in strong language, how can you consider yourself Christian and you are pushing these people who have a right to live there and we have made treaties with, and blah, blah, blah. Of course, it did no good, and the Trail of Tears happened, and it was another sad, sad part of our history. I thought it was, and then I saw something else. So I was going to say it was Andrew Jackson, but okay. So I'm going to do philosophy in one slide. And did any of you take philosophy in college? Yes. And you found it fascinating and exciting. And well, for me, I was so excited to take philosophy, and I got into it, and I thought, what the? Because it's all about deductive and inductive reasoning and la da 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 da, and it was boring and hard. That's what I remember from philosophy. Well, Suzanne, I'm glad you didn't find it boring. But it was hard. So I'm doing a quick summary of philosophy, especially in the 19th century when he was living, because it's probably different today. But at that time, there were two ways of thinking. It was either idealism or materialism. Idealism. The material universe is derived from consciousness. The universe seems to be nearer to a great thought than to a great machine. Each individual consciousness can be compared to a brain cell in a universal mind. Self-realization comes when the finite human becomes the infinite, God divine. Cheers for idealism. Materialism. Consciousness comes only from the material universe. The belief that physical matter is all there is without any spiritual, supernatural, or intellectual existence. Advocates of materialism look forward to an enlightened future as mankind evolves, and science is not compatible with religion. So which section do you think Emerson belonged to? Yes. And Ernest Holmes? And what I would say today, and not being an expert in philosophy, but because we also teach here quantum physics on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock. So I might want to say is there's no battle with science in today's world. Science is proving the concepts in idealism. And so it is. Some of the influences on Emerson: Plato, Plotinus, Hegel, Kant, Van Goethe, Coleridge, and Carlyle. Now, does anybody need to take a little break, a potty break, or do you want me to keep going a little bit? A potty break, I'm sorry. Nobody says anything. You want me to keep going? Okay.
I may not be the expert on Thomas Carlyle, but I can't take of what he wrote. I'm just interested at their connection. Okay. You know, did anybody hear me?
Yeah, I have it.
Everybody.
The question is. Oh, thank you.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay, fine. Thomas Carlyle, they were so close and they wrote back and forth. And I can't think of a thing that Thomas Carlyle was about or wrote at this moment. So could you just tell me?
Yes, and Suzanne, this is not stump the person standing up here game today, but I will say that I don't know the answer, really. Google Thomas Carlyle, because as I Googled him, I didn't understand half of it either. However, what I would say that Carlyle and Coleridge were both influenced by the great German philosophers of the time. There was this information going back and forth. And so a lot of his beliefs must have somewhat coincided with Emerson's ideas.
Both well. Thank you.
Yes.
Yep. And
So transcendentalism. Emerson and his other literary friends decided that they should start their own club, organization, where they could share their ideas and beliefs. So this was very small. There, 10 people, 15 people at the most. They had this, they would debate things. This was, I'm sure, lively discussion going on between these people, but they had certain things they agreed on. And one of them was that the belief that the individual could transcend the physical world into spirituality by simple intuition and what we might call meditation, but going within. Belief that everything in our world is a microcosm of the universe. This is 1840. Isn't that interesting? And science is proving this true. They accepted the idea of the oversoul, a supreme mind that every man and woman share. Oversoul, you can use whatever term you want. God, spirit, the thing itself. And they were influenced by the German philosophers and Hindu philosophies, which were just being translated into English at that time. So Margaret Fuller was designated as the first editor of their journal, The Dial. That The Dial was read by intellectuals all over America, but also in Europe. They published many controversial ideas at that time, including the ineffectiveness of traditional Christianity and discussing the dogma of traditional Christianity, the nature of God, and there we go, 3 more of those hard ones, their anti-slavery position, their support of Native American rights, and their support of women's rights. So do you know why I love this man? So Emerson wrote, when he talked about the universal mind, the oversoul, whatever you want to call it, there is one mind common to all individual men. Every man is an inlet to the same and to all of the same. What Plato has thought, he may think. What a saint has felt, he may feel. What at any time has befallen any man, he can understand. Social justice. The Conservative Party, composed of the most moderate, able, and cultivated part of the population, is timid and merely defensive of property. It vindicates no right, it aspires to no real good, it brands no crime, it proposes no generous policy, it does not build, nor write, nor cherish the arts, nor foster religion, nor establish schools, nor encourage science, nor emancipate the slave, nor befriend the poor, or the Indian, or the immigrant. 1840s? 2017? 18. Thank you. Okay, some words. Nature. He was enthralled by nature. He was out in nature all the time. His best friend was Henry David Thoreau, who spent 2 years living next to Walden Pond and only talking about nature. So the universe is represented in every one of its particles. Is that quantum physics? Everything is made of one hidden stuff. The world globes itself in a drop of dew. The true doctrine of omnipresence is that God appears with all his parts in every moss and cobweb. How cunningly nature hides every wrinkle of her inconceivable antiquity under roses and violets and morning dew. If you notice, his prose is poetic, and they call it poetic prose. And some of his critics today will say, you know, really, his poetry wasn't that great, but his prose was like poetry. The creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn. So, I have more slides, but I have a little game if you would like. And you can take an Emerson quote. Who would like to take an Emerson quote and read it? And then you can keep the quote and take it home. Can you give him? Oh, yeah. Okay.
It takes a good deal of character to judge a person by his. It takes. Testing.
Yeah, now it's on.
It takes a good deal of character to judge a person by his future instead of his past.
By his future.
What would be the use of immortality to a person who cannot use well a half an hour?
Whoops. Whoops.
Yeah. That's a great one.
The highest revelation is that God is in every man.
Anybody else want to read one? Ruth wants to read one.
Why should the way I feel depend on the thoughts in someone else's head?
That's a good one.
We all can use that one.
Yep. Life is a perpetual instruction in cause and effect.
Sitting back in the evening, stargazing, and stroking your dog is an infallible remedy.
There's plenty here. Then I'll just pass it that way.
Sorrow makes us all children again.
So we'll go this way. You can take the mic and if that's all right.
A man becomes what he thinks about most of the time.
All right. Oh, I've got two. So I will put one back. Oh my God, this is funny. A man's library is a sort of harem. Oh my God, that's funny.
Great men are they who see that spiritual is stronger than any material force, that thoughts rule the world.
We don't grow old. When we cease to grow, we become old.
Hope I can read.
I can help you, maybe.
That's just general math. The mind once stretched by a new idea never returns to the original dimensions.
You are magnificent.
Tommy.
When a man becomes a conformist, he is sacrificing the richness of independent thinking.
It is one of the blessings of old friends that you can afford to be stupid with them.
You get to keep the quote. Want to read one?
Depends if I have my glasses. No glasses, no. We dare not trust our wit for making our house pleasant to our friend, so we buy ice cream. I didn't make that up. I really didn't.
There's 2 more left.
We find delight in the beauty and happiness of children that makes the heart too big for the body.
Rob, you want to read one? The last one.
The meaning of good and bad, of better and worse, is simply, is it helping or hurting?
That was it, Roseanne.
Thank you. So, going on, we have more and more quotes on character. People do not seem to realize that their opinion of the world is also a confession of their character. And this one that Rob just read, the meaning of good and bad. Next, what you do thunders above your head so loudly I cannot hear the words you speak. And these other 2 that were in the basket. The mind, once stretched by a new idea, never returns to its original dimensions. When I first met my husband, Mr. Jones over there, he used to say to me, stretch your rubber band. Stretch your rubber band. But he didn't know he was actually quoting Emerson. Fear and regret. Write it on your heart that every day is the best day of the year. He is rich who owns the day, and no one owns the day who allows it to be invaded with fret and anxiety. Finish every day and be done with it. You have done what you could. Some blunders and absurdities, no doubt, crept in. Forget them as soon as you can. Tomorrow is a new day. Begin it well and serenely, with too high a spirit to be cumbered with your old nonsense. This new day is too dear, with its hopes and invitations to waste a moment on the yesterdays. To live like that? Don't be pushed by your problems. Be led by your dreams. So, transcendentalism today influences, of course the club sort of disappeared, and Emerson really didn't even like the term transcendentalism. He kept changing the name all the time because he didn't like labels, he didn't like boxes. But transcendentalism, I believe, has so strongly influenced New Thought philosophy, including this from Ernest Holmes, CSL, The Science of Mind, Emma Curtis Hopkins, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore with Unity Church, Melinda Kramer and Nona Brooks from Divine Science, and also the self-help movement. So it's out there in so many ways, including through Louise Hay and Dr. Wayne Dyer, Oprah, and it goes on and on. It's out there in our society, but we wouldn't label it, oh, that's Emerson's philosophy. No, it's wisdom, you know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's his home. You can go visit his home in Concord. Louisa May Alcott, the daughter of Bronson Alcott, and she's the author of Little Women, that grabbed me right from the beginning. I knew when I read Little Women and read it 100 times, and it comforted me in my unhappy childhood, it was as I got older and I started reading more and more, and I'm like, whatever happened to those transcendentalists? And then I discovered that they went on to be, the thinking went on into our society. But anyway, she had something in her journal. So in 1872, his home caught fire. And the neighbors, it was at night, and the neighbors all rushed to help, and And they were trying to drag his papers, his writings out of his library. I think it was mostly, not the whole house burned down, but I think mostly part of the house, his library was on fire. So she wrote this in her journal that when Emerson's library was burning at Concord, I went to him as he stood with the firelight on his strong, sweet face and endeavored to express my sympathy for the loss of his most valued possessions. But he answered cheerily, "Oh, never mind, Louisa. See what a beautiful blaze they make. We will enjoy that now." So here's some family pictures. Emerson on the left with his son, Edward, and his daughter, Ellen. And then on the right is a family picture in the front of his home. And of course, he and his wife are standing next to the door, and the children and grandchildren. So he did end up with a lot of happiness in his life, despite the beginnings and the sorrows. This was a postcard, an old vintage postcard, which I thought was pretty cool. His home. And a quote, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's, "Though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us, or we find it not." Another one of his quotes, and if you know me, maybe you won't be surprised. I really like this one. "Be silly, be honest, be kind." Almost. So I have to say that I've read a lot about Emerson, but there is this biography of Emerson, which is sort of acclaimed as the ultimate, by Robert Richardson, and it was published in 1996, and it is now on Audible. I don't know if I could sit down and read this biography of 100 chapters. I don't know that I could have had the fortitude, but I have Audible and I listen to it. And I would actually clean house and listen to it and do other things and listen to it. And I've listened to it twice now. It's 24 hours. And for listening once to it. So I've gone through it twice. No. But I just wanted to share, if any of you really want to get deeper into Emerson, there you go. So, any questions? I mean, we've gotten through most of it. What about thoughts, questions?
I guess what I'm just wondering, did he ever speak at churches anymore? Did he how did he, besides the salons, I guess, that he would go to did he do anything at all with church? Or what organized religion?
I don't know for sure, but I think not, because a lot of churches would not have welcomed him. But the Unitarians, I mean, they claim him as their own today. They adore him, and they really, really, they know that how great he was. But and I don't know, I can't answer that, but I do know that he would go all over the country, and once the railroad went all the way to California, he went all the way to California. But before it got to California, he would go to Chicago and all over the Midwest speaking, and this was a source of income. And later in his life, his daughter Ellen went with him to Europe, and he did a lot of speaking in Europe. So always making a living off from this. But he was so loved and so respected, and oh, wouldn't you love that? Steven Spielberg or somebody like that, huh? I have to mention that when his house burned down, all the community got together and got $12,000 in donations to help him rebuild the house. And that's when he and Ellen went to Europe because it was going to take months. His wife and the other kids went to stay at the old man's, which was somebody else was staying there, but it was okay. They were all taken care of, and he was very much loved. And since you came from Boston, do you have any thoughts about, did you know this much about Emerson? Mm-hmm.
Can't hear her if she doesn't talk into the mic.
Sorry.
I was saying that when I lived in Massachusetts, my head was not in this world. So I wasn't paying attention to writers such as he. But I would just love to go back and explore the area and see some of the, these old structures and where things happened.
So I'm from Massachusetts as well, from Western Massachusetts, and I, growing up, felt like there was a huge influence of Emerson, and it was just even in Western Massachusetts. It wasn't even in the Boston area. And then I do remember going to Concord and visiting, all of Concord, and very influenced, of course, by Emerson, who was there for decades and decades, as you said. So I know it's kind of interesting. I have this real fond, energetic feel for him. Yeah, it's really very fascinating. Yeah. And that was the other thing I was just going to say. I love how much you love him. That's really cool.
I felt the same thing that you did and there was not a lot that was taught when I was in school. We're talking eons ago. So, no, truly though, but I remember that little bit that they did give us on Emerson and Thoreau, but it was about, there was a warmth about it. There was a kindness about it. And I don't know why, that's why I got that feeling about him whenever you say his name. What I was going to ask, that would require more work from you, but is there any way you could make a copy of his quotes that you used in this presentation, or did you already do that?
Well, I could pull all of them out. I did have something to pass out to each of you. So on the sheet, you can take a sheet, and I think I probably have enough for you. And that's a bunch of the quotes, but then I made these bookmarks. And A+. Yeah, I think books and my animals just gave me so much comfort through my whole life.
Yeah, it's amazing to me because we had to study him in ministerial. I remember the first time I read his essays, I had to keep reading them over and over, and one page took me, it felt like for hours to get through him. But what I want to appreciate tonight with you, Roseanne, is that you brought his incredible, I want to say human, but it's really not, it's a spiritual being side to us. And I thought to myself, by learning about how he could have claimed victimhood so easily with everything that occurred in his life, and to look at your work and say, let's look at the blaze of fire, that really struck me when his house was going down. For someone to really, what I got out of tonight that I did not know before is how he really walked his talk. He wasn't just saying a bunch of pretty words, a bunch of pretty things for us all to, but he actually was the proof of them. So just excellent work tonight, Rosanna, bringing that part of him to us.
Thank you. And now, what is the name you think of him by? Waldo. He's your friend, Waldo. He's on your side.
With Emerson having such radical views for the time, the period in time, how did he escape any type of retribution from any of the religious people in the communities that he traveled to around the nation?
That's a great question. What I do know is one of his major essays that he wrote, and if you've ever read Self-Reliance, it's all about you be the person that you are, and you stand in your own truth. And you just do not listen to them. I mean, he was a sensitive person. He didn't want people yelling names at him and grabbing their children and saying, don't walk next to that man. Who knows? He just was not going to spend a lot of time and energy talking about that. Yeah.
Just surprising that he escaped any type of potential violence, anything of that nature as well.
Yeah, I've never read anything about that he encountered violence. I do know that he, when the Civil War started, he actually met Lincoln. He was very reluctant to be totally supportive of Lincoln because he kept pressing emancipation, and Lincoln, of course, kept stalling. But he met with him, and then, of course, Lincoln finally said emancipation. And then he had Emerson's cheering support. So it's all a matter of integrity. All of those things that I love about Waldo is what he stood up for, and standing in his own self. And I admire that. And then I love his sweetness. I love his humor. Well, there you go. And I hope you have learned to love him too a bit.
Roseanne, can you close this out? Yeah.
We're going to do a simple benediction. So, if you want to close your eyes, I'm going to close my eyes. If you don't want to, whatever. It's just going to be knowing the truth that, hey, truth continues always, always comes through to us, always. It comes through from the great ones, from Jesus to Emerson to all of the philosophers and all of the thinkers who believe that you live your life according to your beliefs. And I am so glad to be in the presence of those people through their readings and in books written about them. And I know that the essence of Emerson, the essence of Plato, the essence of Christ is right here, right now, working in and through each of us. All we have to do is claim it. So, take this with you, and I hope that as you leave here, that we all recognize that we are all part of the one. And so it is.